I remember one time there was a comedian who was introduced as the funniest person in the whole world. And boy, what a reputation to live up to, you know. Well, there are two things that you should know about me. And the first is that this is my nap time. I eat a big dinner and I'm usually just out of here. So if 20 minutes into this I begin to slow down and stop, well, let's all just take a break, take a little nap, come back in 20 minutes. The second thing you need to know is that I really am delighted to be here. When some months ago, Kayla asked me if I'd work with you on the subject of the biblical view of homosexuality, I not only expressed my great delight, I said I would be absolutely glad to straighten everybody out on this subject. And when she cracked up, I didn't get it at first. And then as she was writhing in laughter, it suddenly dawned on me what I'd said. But it was totally inadvertent, so I can't take credit for this wonderful line. I should have thought of myself. And anyway, in a broader sense, it is not my pretension or presumption that I'm going to straighten anybody out about anything. But what I can do is offer some observations and some reflections that might prove helpful to us who are committed Christians and for whom, therefore, the Scriptures is a sacred book with which we have to wrestle. And as we know, the issue of the biblical view of homosexuality is a hot subject around the country in various denominations. Now, what I'd like to do is to show that the Bible, contrary to some appearances, does not, in fact, condemn homosexuality as such. My plan is to examine every single passage in the Bible that is pertinent to the question or that somebody has said is pertinent to the question. And this time, today, I'd like to deal with those passages which bear on the subject from the Old Testament. And next time when we meet in February, I'll talk about those in the New Testament. Seems like a reasonable, obvious division of labor. And at the end, I would like to argue that between those of us who do think the Bible condemns homosexuality and those of us who do not, the fundamental issue, it seems to me, is not an ethical question about sexual behavior, but it is about a theological issue, a theological question about what we as Christians mean by the incarnation. I mean, that may sound abstruse and difficult, but that's the real issue. What do we mean as Christians when we talk about God becoming flesh for us? All right, now, I want to give you a 5-minute quickie course in the history of the Bible. In the history of, am I wired? Yeah. If some of you would just pass this out, pass it along, that'd be great. What I'd like to do is teach you everything you didn't know but need to know about the history of the biblical peoples. That history begins with the patriarchal period. Back, the best guess would be 1400, 1300, 1200 BC. With stories like those of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all them cats. The stories about them are legendary and reach way back into the ethnic memory of the Hebrew people. Then in 1290 BC occurred the great foundation event of the Bible, namely the Exodus. Moses led the people out of their Egyptian slavery at God's inspiration. That occurred around 1290, as I say. For the next 50 years, they wandered in the desert on the way to the Promised Land. The next 50 years, under Joshua, Moses' successor, was the period when they were beginning to, by force of arms, but mostly by peaceful settlements, settled in the land of Canaan. People were already there, so they had to move in with other people, push them out of the way, or occupy empty space between them. The people there were called the Canaanites. Then around 1200, that period is over, and then followed a couple of centuries called the period of the Judges. when the Hebrew people lived together as a loose confederation of tribes. There were 12 of them. Then, when the Philistines, who in the meantime showed up along the coastal regions, the Hebrew people were always mountain folk, like the Appalachians. They were mountain folk. But down on the seashore, the Philistines showed up, and they began by around 1100 to put the pressure on the Hebrews. And so finally that pressure got great enough so that around 1020 BC, there was a great desire amongst the Hebrews to establish themselves as a kingship, get organized under a king who would lead us forth in our battles. And so that's what happened. That then began the period of the United Monarchy. The three great kings of the United Monarchy are, of course, Saul and David and Solomon. David being the greatest of them, at least in the memory of the people. Then Solomon was such a, what shall I say, a bastard. He was a dictator. He was a manipulator. He was awful, and he generated such resistance and so much angry dissension amongst the people that the kingdom split into the north and the south. The northern kingdom consisted of 10 tribes, and the south only 2, the main one being Judah. So thereafter the southern kingdom are called Jews, right? Heretofore they were all Hebrews. Judah was just one tribe. But now the southern kingdom was called Judah. The northern kingdom was called Samaria, because that was their capital. In 720 came the fall of Samaria. It was done in by the Assyrians. The northerners zigged when they should have zagged in the great geopolitical game of that age, and they were smashed. They were destroyed. Thus, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, they just, for the most part, disappeared. They were sent off and mingled and intermarried, and they just sort of disappeared. There are a few Samaritans left in Israel, about 600 of them in a valley in Israel. But that was the end. That was the end of Samaria. Amos and Hosea were the early prophets in the north who interpreted the disasters that befell them in the light of the covenant loyalty, going back to the Exodus and the Mount Sinai experience and the Ten Commandments. Then, but the southern kingdom, Judah, lasted for a longer time because they were small and could duck below the radar. But they too, around 586, went down the rat hole of history. They were conquered by the Babylonians, who hauled them off into what's called Babylonian captivity. The great prophets of Jeremiah and Ezekiel were the prophetic interpreters of the disasters of those times. But the Babylonian exile lasted only for about 70 years, when the Babylonians, in turn, were done in by the Persians, and the Persian king Cyrus had no particular gripe with the Hebrews, the Jews, so they let them go home. In fact, he even bankrolled their return to Jerusalem. Then around 510, in other words, the temple was rebuilt, and the people, the Jews, struggled back to their feet over the long period of time that led up to Jesus. It's interesting that in these various periods, the leadership of the Hebrew community shifted. Back in the patriarchal time, it was the patriarchs. In Moses' time, it was Moses. In the judges, in the period of the judges, it was the judges. They were heroes, local tribal heroes that rose up to meet challenges. Then it was the kings in the United Monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon. Then when the kingdom split, it was the prophets. All the classical prophets lived during his time. And then when they came back after the exile, it was the priests, and that's very important. It was the priestly group that took the leadership of Judah, and they determined its fate and shaped its life. It was a priestly community, and that lasted right down to the time of Jesus. The Pharisees that Jesus dealt with are remnants of the old priestly pious group of Jews that went back to this post-exilic period. Well, that's a quick summary. Now you know everything you need to know. Now, there are 4 passages in the Old Testament that bear on the question under discussion, namely the relationship, the biblical view of homosexuality, or it is claimed that they bear on it. So let's read the first one. You all brought your Bibles, did you? Here's the first story, the classic story coming from the time of the patriarchs. So it goes way, way back as a legendary remembrance from ancient times. Sodom and Gomorrah are two cities that once existed. I mean, they were historical cities that existed down the south shore of the Dead Sea, which is an absolutely godforsaken place now. But it was subject to earthquakes, and earthquakes produced a lot of fire and brimstone, of various kinds. And apparently this story reflects an actual historical destruction. And in the light of that destruction, the people later tried to understand it in terms of their faith. Just like today we might try to understand the tsunamis. What is God trying to say to us? What does this mean? And maybe 1,000 years from now there'll be a story about that in somebody's religious tradition. Anyway, here's the story. 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. He was one of the earliest patriarchs. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we'll spend our night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so that they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all of the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Lot went out to the door to meet the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters that have not known a man. Sorry about this. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." And they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside, that's the angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, for they were unable to find the door. And then in the succeeding paragraphs, Sodom and Gomorrah get it. I mean, God destroys the city. Ultimately, a fire and brimstone come down, and whew, Sodom and Gomorrah they got their just desserts. Now, the question is, what does that all mean? What are you going to do with this tale? The traditional interpretation goes back at least to the Middle Ages, and no doubt much earlier. And it is based on verse 5, which reads as follows. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Now, the Hebrew word for know is yada. To know that's a translation in English of the verb in Hebrew yada, to know. Now, as you know, yada, sometimes that word can be a euphemism or an indirection for the word for sexual intercourse. As in Genesis 4, and Adam knew his wife Eve and she conceived. Okay? I mean, you know what the verb yada means there. And so it is supposed that this is the translation of the word here. We want to know them. In other words, we want to engage in sexual relations with these guys and bring them out here so we can get on with it. Then, since this was obviously a homosexual situation, these were the men of Sodom, and these were men who were the guests of Lot, then it seemed clear that Sodom was destroyed because of its homosexuality. That is, its homosexual predatory behavior toward these guys. Now, so what to us is a story about a mob of men? So it is a story about a mob of men who are intent on homosexual gang rape. I mean, that's what the story sounds like in the traditional view. Now, this kind of behavior was so horrible to contemplate that it was easy to conclude that this is why God rained fire and brimstone down on the city of Sodom and destroyed it. Thus the word sodomy, of course, you all know what sodomy means. You all know what carnal knowledge means. The carnal knowledge expression comes from this Hebrew idea that to know somebody is to engage in sexual relations. But, I like the word but, don't you? The word but has a lot of power. Okay, everybody satisfied with that? Yeah, okay. But, it turns out that it won't work. It doesn't add up in terms of the story itself. The verb to know, yada, is used in the Old Testament of almost 1,000 times. Somebody counted them. Nothing better to do. 1,000 times. The times that the verb yada means sexual intercourse is 10. So the burden of proof is going to be on the positive, right? I mean, if you're going to say this time it means sexual intercourse, then you gotta make your case. Now, the account makes no sense on the face of it itself. I mean, were all the men, young and old, of Sodom homosexual in orientation? I mean, that would be odd. The entire city? That'd be something. And furthermore, why were they all ticked off? Why were they angry? I mean, if they wanted to engage in homosexual predation, they didn't have to go to Lot's two little visitors. They could have found plenty of people. They could work over each other, I suppose, with no trouble at all. So the question is, A, why were they angry? And B, why were they going after those two guys? That's the question that is not illumined by the traditional interpretation. Now, there is therefore a much more plausible interpretation, if you'll pardon my use of the word plausible. It is much more plausible that has recently been offered up by biblical scholars. One of the things we all need to understand about the ethics of the ancient Hebrews' ethic, and this applies beyond the Hebrews to all the peoples of the ancient Middle East, is the tremendous stress on hospitality. Hospitality. That almost is the great value, social, ethical value that is celebrated and emphasized and stated over and over again among ancient peoples and including the Bible, including the Hebrew Bible. Now, there's a sociological explanation, you might suppose. Travel was very difficult and very dangerous in those times, and there were no motels, and there rarely was any public accommodations in the cities. I mean, you travel any distance and you're on your own. You're out there risking your butt. Look what happened to the guy who went from Jerusalem down to Jericho. I mean, there were land pirates. It was a very, very dangerous business. So it became a value amongst those ancient tribal folk to offer hospitality, the natives, the local folks, to offer hospitality to those who were on the road. That was considered the very highest moral virtue that you could express, to offer hospitality to those who are on the road. But the Hebrews, I don't know what the sociology, whether that how much you want to go with that. But for the ancient Hebrews, they had a theological reason, a religious reason, being faithful, being hospitable to strangers and sojourners and travelers. It is stated beautifully in Leviticus 19, for example, in these words. This is one of the instructions in Leviticus. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you. Why? Because you were aliens in the land of Egypt, and God befriended you. You get the picture? That is stated over and over again. Always be kind to the sojourner, because remember, when you were sojourners in Egypt, God was kind to you. All right. So that became a sacred responsibility for ancient people. Now, notice how Lot in the story is presented as the quintessential righteous man in these terms. I mean, not only did he offer hospitality to the two traveling angels, but he kept badgering them. Won't you please come into my house? Oh no, that's all right. We'll sack out in the square. No, come in. And they finally came in, and he fed them, and he bedded them down for the night, and he prepared a feast for them. I mean, he's the model of the good man taking his sacred responsibilities to the sojourners seriously. Now then, why were the men of Sodom ticked off? What got them all excited? They were very angry. They came out, what are you doing here? Show us these guys. We want to know them. Well, the clue is in verse 9, which says which has one of the leaders of these men say, you are an alien yourself, and you're lording it over us? Oh, Lot is an alien himself, dwelling in the city of Sodom. And so they accuse him of what? Well, it's pretty clear what he was accused of. He was endangering the city contrary to its law. Within the city at night, he entertained strange, unknown, and potentially dangerous men without permission of the city elders. That was a risky business, to have strangers when you couldn't vouch for them, when you didn't know who they were. They might be terrorists, And so the men came up. This guy had broken the rules. He was an alien, so he probably didn't know him. But anyway, he wasn't paying attention to them. He was breaking the rules, and he was because he was entertaining strangers without permission of the city elders, who had to pass on anybody that stayed overnight in the city. So, when the men came, they wanted to know them in the broader sense, in the plain sense that we want to know who these guys are. It had nothing to do with sex, for goodness sake. Nothing. It has to do with, hey, this is a risky business. Who are these guys? Show them to us. Now, it's interesting that we have a clincher, that the real sin of Sodom was not sex. It had nothing to do with sex. It was none of the discussion. Their real sin was what? It was inhospitality. They had violated the sacred responsibility of everybody, especially a Hebrew. And so that was, and listen to what Jesus, this story of the destruction of Sodom is alluded to repeatedly in the Scriptures. It was a dramatic story that bore its way into the Hebrew mind, and it keeps coming up in various contexts. And listen to what Jesus does when he makes a reference to it. Remember when the time that Jesus sent out his disciples 2 by 2 to spread the gospel of the kingdom around? And he said, this is what he says in Matthew 10, whatever town or village you enter, find out who is in it that is worthy and stay there till you leave. As you enter a house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you, here it comes. Are you ready? If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than on the day of judgment for that town. Get the message? He didn't say, hey, if you find any homosexuals there, root them out. Nothing to do with that. If you, however, are not treated hospitably, then I'm sorry, but their fate is worse than the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you look at all the other, there are about 5 different times in the Old Testament itself when the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative is alluded to. And every single time it speaks of greed. I mean, the sin of Sodom is identified as greed, or the love of luxury, or faithlessness. Ezekiel does refer to sexual misbehavior, but the sexual misbehavior he refers to is hetero. And furthermore, his real point is to interpret this metaphorically. That is, for Ezekiel, illicit sexual alliances were metaphorically represented the failure to be faithful to the covenant. It started with Hosea, remember, whose wife was a prostitute? Violated the covenant with her by going off and being a prostitute. And ever since Hosea, that became a metaphor for Israel's betrayal, faithlessness before God. They were married to God, if you will, and here they went off and committed idolatry, and that seemed to them, it seemed in the imagery of Hosea to be like sexual, like an affair, violating the fundamental requirements of the covenant loyalty. So, in other words, none of the interpretations, and most importantly, Jesus' interpretation of the Sodom story, had anything to do with sex, hetero or homo or any other kind you can think of. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with hospitality. That stands at the very top of the Hebrew scale of values. This is clear, I think, especially from what to us is the most repugnant part of the narrative. Lot throwing his daughters out. Hey, go, here's some fresh meat. You guys want to, work up a little sweat here. Here are my daughters. Ravish them if you please. I mean, to us that's horrible, and it is horrible. But I'll tell you one thing: it does make clear that in the ancient times, what was the highest value of all? Hospitality. I'm hospitable. Yeah, but you threw your door. Well, that's unfortunate, and I'm sorry about that. But we're clear about one thing: we're hospitable. I remember there's a wonderful story that used to go around Pilgrim Place that I heard when I first came to Pilgrim Place. Apparently, some years ago, Pilgrim Place had a visiting lecturer, a psychologist, who came to talk to the Pilgrim residents about mental health. And after her lecture or whatever presentation, there was a time for discussion. And the discussion amongst the audience had to do with divorce. The lecturer said, by the way, does anybody ever get divorced around here? Do pilgrim couples ever get divorced? Well, everybody looked at each other and nobody could think. That's changed since then, but nobody could think of anybody in the entire history of Pilgrim Place, any pilgrim couple that had ever divorced. And according to the story, this woman in the back row, old pilgrim, got up and said, "We pilgrims do not believe in divorce. Murder, maybe, but not divorce." In other words, we pilgrims have our standards, right? Well, that's the same here, They had their standards. The trump value was hospitality. Now, so as you can see, sexual stuff does not appear on the screen. Oh, another narrative that I think is wonderful, I enjoy because it's so funny, about Rahab the prostitute. Remember Rahab the prostitute? Well, let me tell you about Rahab the prostitute. You should read the Bible. It's really quite... It seems that Joshua was about to fit the battle in the timeline here. Joshua is Moses' successor, and he was the one who led. He was the military commander, led the settlement into Canaan, and he had to fight a few battles on the way. And his most famous battle was fitting the Battle of Jericho. Remember, and the walls came tumbling down. Well, he was a good general. He sent a couple spies out ahead of time, to check out the land, check out the territory, and make sure that, he could lay his plans properly. Joshua sent 2 men secretly as spies, saying, "Go and view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of the prostitute, whose name was Rahab. A nice person, basically, very friendly. And so they went and entered the house of a prostitute, whose name was Rahab, and spent the night there. Okay? Now, the king of Jericho was told, "Some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land." Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have only come to search out the whole land." But the woman took the two men and hid them. And she said, when the guys came to look for him, look for the spies, "Well, men come to me." I mean, what can I say? But I don't know where they came from, and I don't know where they went. When it was time to close the gate, they came, they went. And you want to know where the men are? I mean, come on, get real. Don't you understand anything? So she, however, had brought, I think that's funny. So she had, however, brought them up to the roof and hid them in the stalks of flax that she'd laid out on the roof. So the men pursued them, the agents of the government of Jericho, pursued them on the way to Jordan as far as the ford, sent them off on a wild goose chase. I think they went that way. But they might have gone, I don't know where they went. Yeah, well, why don't you go this way and see if we can find them. So, of course, they went off on a wild goose chase. Isn't it interesting that they remembered that? And why did they remember it? Well, because she was hospitable. And when Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, and the entire city was destroyed, everybody and everything was destroyed as a sacrifice to God, they made an exception for Rahab. Not only Rahab, but her family, and her mom, and her dad, and her extended family, and uncles, and I don't know, the whole group of them that were spared. Why? Because she was hospitable to the angels, if you will, from amongst the Hebrews. Yeah, but she's a prostitute, don't you get it? I mean, she's a sinner. Oh, so, I mean, but she was hospitable. She was hospitable. And that trumps everything. It's sort of like Ace of Spades, you know, when you're playing, was it Jim Rami or something? I mean, you pull out a spade and that does it. That does it. No matter what you got, that does it. That's the clincher value. The Lord's Supper. Remember the Lord's Supper? Jesus invited his friends to eat at his table. He was the ultimate host. See how powerful that idea is in the biblical tradition, that it should be held up to such stress in the Christian narrative of Jesus. And the flip side of this is what it means to betray. If I sit at your table, you extend to me your hospitality, and I sit at your table and eat your food and share your house with you, and then later you betray me, there's nothing worse than that. Just as there's nothing more beautiful than to be hospitable, there's nothing worse than violating and betraying that hospitality. That's what Judas did. And why, to any ancient reader hearing the story of Judas, that is the worst thing that anybody could. Forget it. Betrayal of hospitality, that's the worst thing that anybody could imagine. So much for chapter. In other words, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has nothing to do with the case, okay? Scratch it out. It is irrelevant to the discussion that we're considering. Okay, passage number 2. Gibeah's crime. And we can deal with this rather more quickly. It's in Judges 9. Here is my marker. Here it is. And the story goes like this. The Levite, a Levite was traveling on a sojourn. And as they neared Jerusalem, the day was far spent, and a servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to the city of Jebusites and spend the night." But the master said to him, "We will not turn aside to the city of the foreigners, who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will continue on to Gibeah." Then he said to the servant, "Come, let us try to reach one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah." And so they passed on and went their way. The sun went down near Gibeah, and they turned aside and to spend the night there. And he went in and sat down at the open square of the city, but no one took them in No one took them in to spend the night. Then at evening there was an old man coming from his work in the field. The man was from the hill country, and he was residing in Gibeah. And then when the old man looked up and saw the wayfarer in the open square, he said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And he answered them, "Well, we're passing through to Bethlehem," and so on. And I'm going on my way home, and nobody has offered to take me in. Will your servants have straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for me and the woman?" He was with his wife. Will you help us? And the old man said, "Well, peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him to his house and fed the donkeys and washed their feet and ate and drank. And while they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, are you ready for this? The men of the city, a perverse lot, in case you had any question about that, surrounded the house and started pounding at the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the men who are in your house so that we may have intercourse with them." Well, okay, now we're clear. I mean, the verb that was used is not yada, okay? So no, my brothers, the Levite said, "do not act so wickedly. Since the man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughters and his concubine. Let them come out now. Ravish them, or do whatever you want. But against the man do not do such a vile thing." Again, we have it's the same story so far. I mean, the parallels are identical. The old man is a foreign resident, just like Lot. The men of the city gather around the door, just like in the other narrative about Sodom. "Bring out the ones who are in the house here that we may know them," in the sexual sense. And then, of course, the Levite offers his daughter and his wife. There's one difference, however, in this story. They gang rape the wife and leave her dead. So when Lot wakes up, I don't know why he could go to sleep at night. I mean, the Levite does not come off well in this story. I mean, while his wife is being ravished out there by these predators, sexual predators, he goes to sleep, And when he wakes up in the morning, there's her dead body. They killed her at her doorstep. "Oh, boy, am I ticked off," says the Levite, about what they did to me. So the Levite is not an honorable character, but still, we do have homosexuality in the story. There's no doubt about that. But the entire history of Jewish and Christian commentary have overwhelmingly interpreted this narrative as, again, about inhospitality and not homosexuality. Notice how the Levite himself, in a later paragraph, interprets this event. I mean, he's really ticked off, particularly because of this murder. So what he does is take the body of his now dead wife, carves it up into pieces, body parts, and sends them all over the hill country, as a way of saying, let's rise up against these bastards, the Gibeonites. And they did. And that was, in the old days, that was the way you did that. You got people excited. You carved up somebody like your wife and sent the body parts around, and that's depicted as being done several times in the Old Testament. This is rough and tumble stuff, But it's interesting that the Levite himself, when he broadcasts this terrible crime, he does not identify the crime as sexual at all. He identifies the crime as murder. Those guys committed murder. That was what got him excited. So once more, this story, which is obviously influenced by the earlier one about Lot, really doesn't carry. It's irrelevant too. Nobody ever made anything out of it except murder or inhospitality, and the sexual element, though it's obviously there, was simply ignored by tradition. All right? That's 2. We got 2 to go. How are we doing for time? Pardon me?
That was in Leviticus.
Yeah. No, that's the story we were just talking about? No, it's in Judges. Judges 19, Gibeah's crime. The third one is to be found in 2 Samuel 1 and is the story of David and Jonathan. And people have said, this is a curious kind of relationship. Maybe it has something to tell us. In the book of 1 Samuel, we read about the rise of the monarchy. Remember the monarchic period. And the latter part of 1 Samuel has to do with Saul, who is the first king. And Saul does great for a while. He brings all the people together. He's a charismatic figure, but things go wrong. He begins to go crazy. The pressure is on him. And finally, at the end of 1 Samuel, he and his son Jonathan are killed in battle. There were great tragedies in the history of ancient Israel. They are killed in battle. And David, who has been sort of hanging around the edges of things, who's a great warrior, now becomes the lead character and ascends the throne of Israel. And it turns out that Jonathan, that is Saul's son, and David became bosom buddies. I mean, they were very, very close friends, to say the least. And at the beginning of 2 Samuel, David delivers himself of the following lamentation as he ponders the terrible fate and disaster that has befallen Saul and Jonathan himself. He lost his king, he lost his best friend. And here's what he says. David intoned his lamentation over Saul and his son Jonathan. He said, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ascalon," those are Philistine cities. They were fighting the Philistines. "Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, the daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields." That's why they were killed up there. "For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul anointed with oil no more. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul. You clothed with crimson in luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved are you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." Well, that's quite an impressive lament. And people look at this and say, wow, looks like we have more than just a little close friendship here. It looks like this reference to the love of you is more beautiful, or it passes the love of women. Well, it could be. The trouble is, we don't know. We don't know. So we just leave it at that. It could be, might not be. We just draw blanks, because like when you want to do a diagnosis, you have to have a number of symptoms, you have another things that point in the same direction before you can be sure that you've interpreted correctly. And there aren't any. There aren't any. So moving right along, we go to passage number 4. Really, there's nothing you can say about it. We just don't have a sufficient insight into the language and how it was used and what was going on between them. Then it wouldn't bother the Hebrews if it were homosexual. I mean, they weren't interested in that question. You get the picture? That was not a hot button question for them. Anyway, the fourth one and the last one. Now, the question then of whether homosexual relations are intrinsically contrary to God's will, to that question, the passages we've considered so far are simply irrelevant, okay? Irrelevant. But, here's another one of those buts, but there are passages from chapters 18 through 20 of Leviticus that are relevant, for they plainly condemn homosexual activity. Here, it seems, is scriptural authority for the rejection of the homosexual lifestyle. So we got to pay attention to them. This is the only place in the Old Testament where we have to work really hard. And here's some of the stuff that Leviticus is the great priestly law code. Every now and then at critical points in the history of the Hebrew people, they produced compendiums of the law. God lays responsibility on God's people, and somebody's got to try to spell it out. The oldest one is the famous covenant code in Exodus 20. Read it. It's interesting. 10 Commandments, very ancient, go way back. Then there was a great reform during the time of Josiah, who was one of the kings in the south, the Jewish kingdom, about 30, 40 years before the fall of Jerusalem, where the book, and that is the book of Deuteronomy, which is also a book of laws, all purporting to go back to Moses. All right, Moses is the great lawgiver, and he gave them on Mount Sinai, he gave the law, and then book of Deuteronomy was suddenly discovered by the king. Somebody stuffed it in the treasury gift box and found it there, and it seemed so impressive. Anyway, it was a prophet declared it to be the words of Moses. Apparently it was a collection of laws preserved in the north, because it was entirely focused on Moses, which was a northern feature. And so that's Deuteronomy. But then, when the priest took over, remember in the last part, after the exilic period, the priest took over, they really did a number. I mean, they worked up a book of laws, Mosaic law, that is amazing. And it's called Leviticus. It's very late, therefore, post-exilic, although some of the traditions which it reflects no doubt go way back, who knows when, maybe to Moses himself. But it was the special treasury of law by the priests who are now in the cutting edge of the Hebrew or the Jewish scene. It is, as one person put it, it's an extended timeout in the narrative as Israel picks its torturous way through the lethal minefield of pagan gods and goddesses and idols, all designed to appeal to our God fantasies. In other words, when the people struggle to keep the integrity of their faith in spite of all the attractions and blandishments and whatnot of the peoples around them. That's what Leviticus is all about. You must be a holy people. Why? Because God is holy. Okay. Says that over and over and over again. What does it mean to be holy? Well, I got 500 pages of stuff here that'll tell you. It is a book of, including, boring out of your mind, some of it. Regulations for worship, ceremonial cleanness, how the priest should dress, all about what sacrifices are acceptable, what aren't. If you're going to sacrifice, well, what are there are 4 or 5 different kinds of sacrifice, separate chapter for each one of them, and all kinds of references to holy days and diet and skin disease, you name it. Every aspect of life is addressed in the Leviticus. So after opening chapters of elaborate instructions about the various kinds of offerings and ordination of priests and duties of priests and so on, the book turns to daily affairs: childbirth, food, body discharges. You want to read about body discharges? And sex, sexual relations, in the midst of which homosexual relationships are condemned. So there it is. But anyone who supposes that these verses, well, we should read them, shouldn't we? A couple of them anyway. Here you go. Chapter 18, Leviticus. Speak to the people. Yahweh spoke to, Yahweh is the name of God. God spoke to Moses and saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am Yahweh your God. Everybody clear about that? God is God. Let's start with that premise. Now, you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt. Oh yeah? How do they do it in the land of Egypt? Where you lived. And you shall not do it in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You must be separate. My ordinances you shall observe, and my statutes you shall keep, following them. I am Yahweh your God, in case you just forgot what I just said. You shall keep my statutes and my ordinance by doing so one shall live. I am Yahweh. And so it goes on to talk about how you shall, none of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. That means engage in sexual intimacies. I am Yahweh. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the namesake nakedness of your mother, who is your mother. You shall not uncover her, and blah, blah, it goes on about all the people in the world you shouldn't uncover the nakedness of. And it covers a lot of people. In fact, most people in the world. And in chapter 19, it goes on about how you should speak to the congregation of the people and say to them, you shall be holy, for I am Yahweh your God am holy. You shall each revere your mother and father. You shall keep my Sabbath. I am Yahweh your God. Do not turn aside to idols or cast images for yourselves. I am Yahweh your God. You hear the drumbeat. When you offer a sacrifice of well-being to Yahweh, offer it in such a way that it is acceptable. And there's chapters on what makes it acceptable. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name. I am Yahweh. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal. You shall not keep yourself in wages of labor until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. Everybody in favor of that? And you shall fear God. You want to say it? I am Yahweh. You shall not render an unjust judgment. It goes on and on about the various requirements of a just social order. Then, it says here, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Be careful now. God is God. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. Remember that women all belong to men. So what you do to a woman is really against the man because she is her property. And both of them should be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall be put to death. Be careful about that. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is on them. And so on. And then, okay, that's fairly clear. Is it fairly clear? Now, it looks like we're up against a biblical declaration that homosexual relationships are against God, and God keeps going around saying, I am God. But anyone who supposes that these verses settle the question need to do some more work. They now face two, in my humble estimation, insurmountable difficulties. On the face of it, it looks very clear, but anybody who knows ancient Hebrew will understand right away that it is precisely not clear. It may be clear in English, but it is not clear in Hebrew. Now, the first of these two difficulties is this. While Leviticus condemns many things we today would agree are morally unacceptable, incest, rape, adultery, intercourse with animals, that was a big problem, contempt for the poor, dishonoring your parents, cheating, lying, and so on. A lot of stuff in Leviticus say, we should, that should be forbidden. And there are lots of things elsewhere in the Bible that God is represented as in favor of, or perhaps even indifferent to, like obliteration of whole tribes and cities as a sacrifice to God. Yeah, that's okay. In fact, God orders that on a few occasions. Oh, Jericho, blow them away. And then we say, that's immoral. Well, that's your point of view. That's not Leviticus's. Execution of adulterers. I don't suppose anybody really serious propose that these days. Polygamy? No problem. Consignment of women to status of male property? No problem in Leviticus. It may be a problem for us. Slavery is quite acceptable throughout the Bible, as a matter of fact, as an institution. And conversely, God is said to prohibit all kinds of things that we, including the most conservative Christians today, accept today as a matter of course. Eating the flesh of unclean animals. Anybody bothered by that? Pork. Eat pork? Oh, should do that. According to Leviticus, that's an abomination. Sowing your field with two kinds of seeds. That is absolutely prohibited. And you think, what? No hybrids, folks. That's the end of that. Putting on a garment made of two different materials. That's the one. That's my favorite. That's forbidden. It's an abomination. And I started checking my labels. Cutting one's beard. No. That's an abomination. Now, isn't it odd that some folks today claim scriptural warrant for the view that homosexuality is a sin, but divorce each other at about the rate of the rest of the world, the rest of folks, even though Jesus specifically prohibits divorce? You get the problem? So the difficulty is, why pick out homosexuality as forbidden, but ignore all those other forbidden things? And why do some of the things, as a matter of course, that are forbidden in the book of Leviticus? In other words, the first problem is that a person who claims that this is a prohibition of homosexuality have to figure out why this is picked out and all the other prohibitions are ignored. So you get the first difficulty is that how come you choose this one and not some others, including the one that Jesus specifically condemns, namely divorce. I don't know how they do that. I'd like to know. But the second difficulty is even worse, it seems to me. Leviticus 18:22 says, quote, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." Now, it's interesting, by the way, to note that only gay sex is here being referred to, not lesbian relationships at all. The Bible never talks about lesbian relationships. Never. There's no word for it. There's no word for homosexuality in the Old Testament. This just wasn't a big thing for them, you know what I mean? If it was, they'd have a word for it, but it isn't. They don't. But lesbian folks are just out of the picture entirely, and the reason is fairly obvious, namely, the ancient Hebrew theory of reproduction was that the male semen carried the entire seed, as they called it, of the person to be born. And the mother just provides the ground, the fertile ground in which the seed can grow. So guess to whom all the children belong, huh? I mean, it's a perfectly honest mistake, you know. I mean, it looked like when you deposited the seed in the ground, then it's sort of like a farmer, you know, planting seed, and the ground doesn't do anything to provide nourishment. And they thought this is a parallel. They were wrong, but at least you can't blame them. They didn't know any better. But it did present them with, it does explain to us why lesbianism is irrelevant, because there's no seed involved. Okay? You could argue that the basic reason that homosexuality is forbidden is because it wastes the seed, the sacred stuff, you see? And that's why masturbation is prohibited as well. I mean, this is sacred material, and you shouldn't waste it. But with regard to lesbians, hey, folks, that's not an issue, right? So go for it. It isn't. It is simply not an issue, and it can't be an issue given their understanding of the way the world is. All right. Now, that said, let's go back to. So we're home free with a lesbian, right? Let's go back to the gay situation. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. Obviously, this is directions to men, right? Now, the word abomination. The Hebrew word abomination is a tricky, tricky word. And it isn't just a general word for bad. This is abominable. No, it is a technical word in Hebrew. The word in Hebrew, I've written on the board, it's tovah. Toiva. I'll get my Hebrew straight. And toiva does not, almost always, there seem to be exceptions, but usually does not refer to anything intrinsically evil, like rape or murder or theft, but what is ritually unclean for Jews, like eating pork or engaging in intercourse during menstruation. Those are abominations. Now, if you read Leviticus with this in mind, and I read the whole stupid book with this in mind, to see whether that sounded right. Every time you read Leviticus with this distinction in mind, you can see that the things that are forbidden, that are called abominations, are forbidden because refusing to do what the pagan idolaters do marks Israel as a special people. They were markers for being a special people. To avoid toiva, abominations, is to avoid those things which make them look like the idolaters around them. To commit them involves them, in other words, in ethnic contamination. The issue is not that they're evil in themselves, it's just our way of marking out who we are. We're special, we're different, we're holy. So the prohibition applies only to Jews. Only to Jews. It's sort of like the Catholics used to be forbidden to eat meat on Fridays. Is there something wrong in itself with eating meat? No. Nobody ever thought of that. It is the Catholic thing to do which identifies you as a Catholic Christian. And there's Catholics never had the idea, nobody should eat meat on Friday. If you're a Catholic, you don't eat meat on Friday, but if you're a Protestant, you can eat what you want, You see the point? Now, when the Bible Old Testament Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, this distinction became even more clear, made more sharp. It was sharp enough in Hebrew. The laws that are called abominations, toiva, are what I just said, ritual requirements. But they did have a word, simal, which means, which refers to things that are really wicked, bad, rape, or stealing, or something like that. Injustice, not giving hospitality. That was zimal. They weren't abominations. They were really bad. All right. The distinction is hidden there behind the word abomination. Now, when the Bible the Hebrew scriptures got translated into Greek, then it became really even more clear. The Greek equivalent of toiva was anomia. You know a little Greek? Nomos is a Greek word for law, rules. And a is the negative prefix. So something that is anomia is against the law of God in this case. All right, those are really bad. But in Greek, they use the word deligma to refer to those ritual or ritualistic requirements that marked the Jews as people, as special people. Indeed, ancient Hebrew scholarly interpretation considered these abominations had been forbidden Jews as part of their distinct ethnic heritage, or because it was associated with idolatry. Over and over again in Leviticus you read, don't be like them. Don't be like them. If they do something different. Not that what they do is wrong necessarily in itself, but we want to be different. The Leviticus constantly calls on the Jewish people to be holy. Well, and that sounds like being righteous. A holy person is somebody who is morally. No, that's not what it means in Hebrew. The word translated holy means separate. Separate. It doesn't mean you're better than anybody else. It just means that God has set you out. It's like a volunteer fire department in our little town in Wisconsin. They were separated out. They weren't better than anybody else, but they were separated out for a special task, and they wore special insignia and uniforms and special training because they were singled out for a special task. That's what to be holy means, and that's what these abominations, or the rejection of these abominations, meant for them. So the issue again and again is not is whether sex is right or wrong, however expressed, but the issue is keeping one's Jewish identity. That's the issue. Like Catholics, not eating meat on Friday. Well, I don't know about you, but I come to the following conclusions. Number one, the Old Testament does not answer the modern question. Are committed homosexual relationships good in God's sight? It simply does not address the question. Guess what? It's up to you. It's up to you. If God doesn't address it, you can figure out, hey, that's something you can figure out for yourselves, that God is not interested particularly. No doubt God is interested in commitment and love, but how you express it, hey, go for it. That's up to you to shape your existence before God. Conclusion number two, there is no clear sexual ethic in the Old Testament. To me, that's what is so attractive about the Old Testament. It's sort of rough and ready, and things change, and they cook up all these weird rules, like you can't wear a garment with two kinds of cloth. And there's Rahab the prostitute. Hey, she's great, isn't she? She's a prostitute. Who cares? She was hospitable. It's a wonderful mix of times and places and things. The great thing about the Old Testament is that if you look past this, you can see through the cracks the light of God's real truth coming through. And if the Bible were any more organized, any more consistent, any more doctrinally correct, it would be terrible, wouldn't it? It would be something you couldn't trust. Something you couldn't trust. Third conclusion. The Old Testament Hebrews were not nearly as excited about sex as we are. They were rough and ready folk. Hey, yeah, they were good lusty folks. Be fruitful and multiply, get out there and go for it. They didn't have any problems with sex at all, like we do. Next, my fourth conclusion, the whole question of committed, the whole question of committed same-sex relationships in the Old Testament is simply never raised as an issue. It is never considered. And the last conclusion, the highest moral responsibility in the Old Testament is hospitality. The thing most commonly denied gay and lesbian persons today. And so, as I got thinking about all this, I thought, isn't it odd that what is dubious in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is held up as a moral absolute by many today. And what is absolute in the Bible, hospitality, is betrayed and denied. Amen. We got enough time for some questions or comments?
Any questions for Stan?
I have one.
Yeah.
I would like to echo my exclamation point a while ago. I just came in for a few minutes, and what I heard was just what we expected from you, saying wonderful. But I really can't believe I walked in here that masturbation is unholy. What's going to run about that?
You're a senior pastor, folks.
You can handle it.
Thank you, he's your own.
Well, what's left unsaid?
Stan, thank you so much. I
Yeah,
can't
we
wait
got
for
it.
next month.
Yeah.
Great.
Next month, New Testament.